At the start of the year, Dominic Cummings warned that the deep state, or the establishment, will do all they can to try to derail Reform UK and destroy Nigel Farage's prospects of becoming Prime Minister. He said on the Spectator's podcast, they'll leak medical records, they'll leak tax records, they'll bug his phone and leak that, they'll do anything they need to. And it seems that it's started, because the Times has published an extensive expose on quite an old story, really, which is Nigel Farage's friendship with George Cottrell, or Posh George, who previously was convicted for money laundering and fraud because he said that he could essentially launder money that was being used for drug trades, and he got caught in a police sting. And to evade prison time, he explained to the American government how he would do it, which is why he then wrote a book saying how to get away with money laundering, and Farage attended the book launch earlier this year. Now, I think this isn't a particularly interesting story, and I don't think most of the public will care much about it either, other than that it plays into the perception that Nigel Farage is more interested in doing things which line his own pocket than in saving the country. But first, this video is sponsored by Gold Bullion Partners. Use my affiliate link down in the description if you want to book your free consultation to invest in gold or silver. Gold Bullion Partners investments are exempt from CGT and VAT tax and are eligible for self-investment pension plan. They offer secure, allocated and segregated storage in London and Zurich, including for my American viewers, and for my viewers, they give you preferential storage if you use the affiliate link down in the description. Nice touch. Gold Bullion offers wholesale access to both supply and pricing, and they offer all customers a buyback guarantee. And for those of you who want all of my content ad-free going forwards, subscribe to my Substack for as little as £5 per month. That's also linked down in the description below. What can I say? I've got twins on the way and more mouths to feed. Now, I don't think this is necessarily true, but that certainly is the perception when he makes quite an impressive sum of money from Gold Bullion sponsorships, donations from the likes of Christopher Harborne, the Thailand-based British crypto billionaire, and when he's being provided security and properties by George Cottrell, who he describes as being like a son to him. And Cottrell is, of course, also involved in crypto. He's like a crypto gambling platform, and so it becomes conspicuous that one of Reform's first policies was to do with crypto regulation against central bank digital currency, which I'm also against, which I don't think is accessible on their website anymore, rather than something like immigration, which is the more pressing issue for its base. And although I understand that Farage has inordinate personal security costs given the number of threats made against his life, including to his family, threats that he's already faced by having concrete and milkshakes lobbed at him on the campaign trail in 2024. So I understand security is very expensive, private security, the type that he has, the sort of very professional ex-army types, very expensive. I'm very sympathetic. He will struggle to shape the perception that he's in it for the money. And again, I don't know if that's entirely fair, but that is a perception which is sticking and that they are worried about. And this is the story that has been trotted out by the Times, which has always been a mouthpiece for, let's just say, the establishment. It codes more centre-right and Tory-flavoured, which is why they have Fraser Nelson and Danny Finkelstein and Sebastian Payne and Melanie Phillips writing for them. Nevertheless, it's still the establishment. This is why the Times has run this piece. And George Cottrell's friendship with Farage is hardly a secret. And anyone who didn't brief Farage ahead of time saying they will use George against you was setting him up for failure. Because, of course, they were going to recycle Cottrell's criminal record to attack Farage and trying to rubbish his character ahead of trying to become Prime Minister. Anyway, there's this really long piece. They're complaining that George was swanning about using Reform UK branded business cards, that Farage gave George a printed copy of his maiden speech in the Commons on the 7th of October, signed "Thanks for everything, Nigel," that George and Farage have been seen with the same security at the same properties, that Cottrell has been financing some of Farage's social media team and has been cosy with Nick Candy, Reform's treasurer. Nevertheless, all of this is to create a climate of suggestions of financial impropriety, even if a smoking gun or any evidence at all hasn't been found yet. The same goes for this £5 million donation from Christopher Harborne, because Farage got gifts from both Harborne and from Cottrell prior to becoming an MP that he didn't disclose. What I think has happened here is Farage being a perpetual outsider to actual parliamentary process, and this is meant to be a slight, but isn't that interested in parliamentary procedure either, given I think he anticipates it would always be weaponized against him, just didn't register the donations from friends and allies as gifts that he received ahead of becoming an MP, because he didn't realise you had to do that. And the suggestion is, of course, that this is a form of lobbying. I'm not making that suggestion. People are making that suggestion. And so again, it creates the dark cloud of negative public perceptions around a Farage premiership at a time he doesn't need this, when they've lost successive by-elections, they're stagnating in the polls, and as we will see in this video, there seem to be the contours of infighting in Reform, in the anticipation that Farage might face a by-election and could even be unseated as Reform's leader in untimely fashion before the next general election. And one of the reasons that this is plausible is because Josh Babarinde, the president of the Liberal Democrats, has sent a letter to the Parliamentary Commissioner for Standards, referring Farage to the Parliamentary Standards Authority based on the Times piece about George Cottrell and, of course, the other donation from £5 million, the undeclared gift from Christopher Harborne, which Farage hasn't had a firm story about spending. I've got to be careful with my wording here because, of course, this is a very fraught case to do with both parliamentary procedure and the law. But Farage has already said I could spend it on Ferraris if I want to, I could spend it on private security. I would just caution against any flippancy in messaging. And again, you know, Reform don't have to take my advice. But saying that you're spending it on security because of threats to Farage's life that he faces in his crusade to try and fix the country is a lot more persuasive, and frankly, I'm sure there are certainly elements of truth there, narrative, than, well, I can spend it on property or cars or pints or whatever I like. Because people want to know that you are doing this job at significant personal cost, and incidentally financial cost, rather than you're getting rewards for political campaigning. And while I and everyone on the right don't resent Farage for making money, there are the implications of running a Cameo account and wishing Big Chungus a happy birthday, or having multiple properties, considering he works so often that he can't possibly be occupying them at all times. There is the insinuation that wealth or material gains are a distraction or a potential vulnerability for Farage that could be leverage to either sabotage his career, as they're clearly trying to do here, or to distract him or discourage him from pursuing an agenda should Reform win, which will actually rescue the country from the various crises, economic, demographic, legal, that we face. And so this is a legitimate worry. But he is aided by the perception that this is a vindictive, political attack to prevent Reform from forming the next government, because mouthy midwits like Labour's Baroness Harriet Harman, who worked with the legal advocacy organisation that was partnered with the Paedophile Information Exchange in the 70s, by the way, so her record isn't exactly squeaky clean, she was quoted today as saying, Farage is attacking and trying to delegitimise the system, and if it comes to a finding by the Commissioner that he has been in breach of the rules, the way he's conducted himself while he's been under investigation will be taken into account as an aggravating fact when it comes to the penalty. So you saying the establishment are launching a witch hunt against me to stop me from being Prime Minister, I think fact-check true, or whether or not there are any grounds of procedural impropriety on Farage's part here, that will be used as then additional reason for the system to punish you. And I think, despite the crabs in a bucket mentality we see in Britain around wealth and success, I do think this will endear more people to Farage than it will have people wanting to urinate on his political gravestone, because this will be seen as akin to when the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago and rifled through Melania's underwear drawer, or when Trump was shot, and then it wasn't even 24 hours before the media started calling him Hitler, trying to put him in the crosshairs of another assassin again, or when Trump had his mugshot taken. I think you will start to see some sympathy to Farage, and the narrative being put forward by both Farage and Zia Yusuf that the establishment are actually terrified of Reform, when Reform has suffered from a perception, and not unwarranted, that it is drifting towards the establishment by its incorporation of figures like Nadeem Dorries or Nadim Zahawi. by its softening on policy for a few years after the general election, and now them competing to regain their credibility after the murder of Henry Novak, or their promises to abolish indefinite leave to remain and return the Boris wave home. There is clearly an anxiety within Reform to recover the ground that they've lost to the likes of Restore Britain, but also in the Red Wall, all of those voters they've alienated by taking Tories on and looking like a Tory recycling bin. Again, this is something that Zia Yusuf has been very astute about. He's a very cunning political operator. And if anything, it will add credibility to their anti-establishment bona fides if Nigel Farage is persecuted for this donation. This might be helpful going into the by-election that Farage is worried he might face in Clacton over the Cottrell story and the £5 million donation from Harborne, because according to the I paper, Farage has told friends he is worried about facing the by-election if he's found to have broken rules over the undeclared £5 million gift from Christopher Harborne. Farage won the Clacton seat comfortably in 2024 with an 8,405 vote majority, and overturning it would require a substantial swing away from Reform, and that swing might be aided by Restore Britain, because Rupert Lowe has warned that Restore would throw everything they have at trying to derail Farage's political career. Lowe and the team decided to tell the Daily Mail this for some reason. Yes, the same Daily Mail that were publishing 2 back-to-back front pages trying to depict him and Restore Britain activists and supporters as neo-Nazis, trying to ruin the lives of 19-year-old Angloid for attending the Remigration Conference. For some reason, they provided comment to the Mail, and Rupert said, "Restore Britain is now an established national political party with a strong base in constituencies such as Clacton. If there is a by-election there, or indeed any neglected seaside town, we will fight it with everything we have," which then produced the headline, the editorialising by the Daily Mail saying, "Rupert Lowe's Restore Party vows to end Nigel Farage's career." Because if Nigel Farage was voted out in a by-election in Clacton, this would actually end his parliamentary career. It would render it impossible for him to become Prime Minister, because for those outside of Britain, you have to be a sitting MP and your party must win a parliamentary majority for you to be elected Prime Minister. It's not a presidential system. And what would happen to Restore then, I think, is they would lose a substantial amount of support as well, because they would be seen as participating in this witch hunt. Full disclosure, I do not want Nigel Farage involuntarily retired over some bullshit parliamentary procedure. And I also don't want, for the health of the right, Restore Britain to look like it is gleefully, vindictively playing a part in said witch hunt. I think, actually, fences should be largely mended between the two parties, though the extent to which that is possible between Farage and Lowe is unlikely, but at the very least, I don't want there to be much bad blood between the good people in both parties, and there are good people. But there are also people in Restore who are motivated more by anti-reform animus than they are by fixing the country, and that's not Charlie, Harrison and Lewis. I just want to insist, they're good men, they are my friends, they're incredibly competent, and there are people in Reform that actually lament that the likes of Charlie, Harrison and Lewis are not in Reform, were not snapped up at the time, because they're clearly talented and are good faith actors. And there are people in Reform who are also hoping that Restore collapses because they're worried that if they peak above 3% nationally, and they're already polling at about 4 to 6% consistently, then that wipes out Reform's chances at winning a national majority at the next election. So there is a lot of enmity, animosity between the two camps, and I don't want this animosity to feed into this potential by-election being run in Clacton, because the right more broadly will sustain many self-inflicted wounds. This will just be to the detriment of all of us. When approached by the I paper with the claims, a spokesman for Reform UK said Farage didn't break any rules. Mr. Farage has always been clear that this was a personal unconditional gift and no rules have been broken. We look forward to this being put to bed once and for all. They had the same line from Robert Jenrick doing the Sunday media rounds, the sort of ministerial tours, even though he's not a minister. And they've been saying that all the donations are above board and don't come with any political strings attached. Now again, that narrative doesn't quite pass the sniff test. Sure, Christopher Harborne might have wanted to reward Farage for Brexit many years later with £5 million. But given Reform's interest in crypto, given Reform has mentioned it as an industry of the future, Farage himself, at various press conferences, it does provide ammunition to those that are suggesting this was a quid pro quo. And this is why some of Farage's allies have even said, look, you may as well just hand the donation back. But I don't think that will solve the problem either, because that apology will be taken as weakness, and that will be interpreted by the state as an act of contrition, and therefore an admission of wrongdoing, and a reason to throw the parliamentary book at Farage even more. So this is a no-win situation, and it's a situation that, frankly, people should have been advising Farage against as he anticipated re-entering politics, or he should have at least had very scrupulous lawyers and advisors around him upon entering politics, making sure he crossed every T and dotted every I as he was going through the building, because, as Dominic Cummings said, they were always going to try and pull something like this. They should have anticipated it. And it's clear that Reform are now interested in pivoting the narrative and, for want of a better term, covering their backsides, because they've just hired veteran journalist Miles Goslet, who used to work for Rupert Murdoch's papers, and recently helped write Lord Ashcroft's book, The Farage Factor, about Farage. So it's clear that they want to bring some fresh advisors and essentially spin doctors in-house to try to create a more convincing narrative than the one that's currently out there on matters such as the Harborne donation and George Cottrell's affiliation with the party. But some people have already smelled blood in the water, including people at Reform, who are talking to people like Seb Payne, Fraser Nelson, and The Observer, the subsidiary of The Guardian, and I want Reform to internalise this rule. If Fraser Nelson thinks it's good and sensible, do the literal opposite. He could say the sun is rising tomorrow, and I would be preparing for the apocalypse. Fraser Nelson gets every political issue wrong, and he's already admitted in front of cameras in 2017 to advising former Conservative politicians to just lie to the public, to say, "Oh, I hear your concerns," while continuing to conduct horrendous policies, like mass migration anyway. He lies with manipulated statistics, pointing to a graph by saying, actually, crime's gone down, while a black guy is stabbing a white guy right behind it. Anyway, he wrote this piece saying, is Nigel Farage becoming a liability for Reform? Which means they are eager to get Farage out the way, because they're increasingly seeing Farage as the problem. Previously, the likes of Fraser Nelson and Danny Finkelstein praised Farage for having a moderating effect on the party, denouncing far-right ethno-nationalism, which they can't define because they literally think anyone can become British if they're born here, or they subscribe to British values, or even if they break British values and are born here, they're still British. It doesn't make any sense. Nevertheless, these people were praising Farage as essentially a gatekeeper for their kind of politics. And the moment that Farage said, Henry Novak's murder is proof of anti-white racism, we're going to get rid of the Equality Act, we're going to reverse mass migration, actually I've changed my mind on mass deportations, and I am sort of concerned about demographic change, even though I haven't put it in as explicit terms as Farage once did in 2021. The moment he started changing his messaging to give life to the claim that Farage was secretly based all along and he was just hiding his power level, suddenly the likes of Fraser Nelson and The Times, conspicuous they're published in the same place as the Cottrell expose, have an allergic reaction, and they start trying to push Farage out of Reform, either neutralising Reform or replacing Farage with one of the Tory defectors that they're more comfortable with. And in this piece, Nelson quotes, I would say, a treacherous Reform staffer, because if you're talking to Fraser Nelson about the inner workings of Reform, you're a traitor. It's no different to talking to The Guardian. He quotes Farage staffer saying, Nigel knows he's made a big mistake. He knows how bad this £5 million looks and it's cutting through to voters. Some activists say the party came a strong second in Makerfield in spite of Farage, not because of him. And it's true, the public opinion is heavily divided on Farage, even though Reform are top of the polls, with that lead narrowing. Farage still has a large net unfavourability rating, despite his authenticity on I'm a Celebrity, and also despite the rare glimmers of like Farage's actual personality that you see when he's walking his dogs along the seaside in a Barber jacket. Because, you know, apparently he's big on bird watching, he likes going to the countryside and retreating away from the Isengard that is Reform HQ in Millbank Tower. And not enough of that shines through. And so I think what ends up happening is the perception of Farage as a kind of political Del Boy, a Jack the Lad, a wheeler dealer, a guy who likes pints in the pub and is only in it for the cash in hand, that's bled through to the national political consciousness, and that's poisoned the well, and it's meant that plenty of people just don't trust him. They treat him like a used car salesman. Rather, and I think this is actually why he's looking increasingly tired, rather than a guy that is coming to terms with the enormity of the problem, and is actually trying to summon up some courage that he hasn't had to have before, and is slowly coming around to the idea that the moment has called for leadership, and he's almost let that moment pass him by, if not he's worried that it actually has passed him by and he's racing to catch up with it. Nevertheless, the public perception is increasingly that Farage is just in it for the money, and he needs to work to reverse that, and a by-election, being imposed upon him before he can do that certainly won't be helpful. But Fraser says, without him, reform would not collapse. He almost sounds gleeful about it. When Fraser Nelson made his Channel 4 film about reform last year, he ran an opinion poll about post-Farage support. It would still be very strong. Reform is still a force for hope for millions who view the established parties with contempt. So his departure would not be an extinction-level event for reform. It might even be a chance for renewal. Translation, I want to conduct political necromancy with the Conservative Party, but just rebrand it as reform. And I'm uncomfortable with reform when it's led by Farage and now Zia Yusuf, because Zia Yusuf is not quite David Cameron in diversity body armour as I once quipped, and that Fraser Nelson had hoped, but instead he's, ironically, the most immigration hardline in the party, and so Fraser Nelson now hates his guts, and hopes that he's replaced with someone a bit softer and more Tory instead. A recent survey of party supporters, conducted by Lord Ashcroft, it should be noted, suggests the race would be between Zia Yusuf, its policy chief, and Richard Tice, its deputy leader. Side note there, Rupert Lowe actually had higher favourability ratings to take over as leader from Nigel Farage than Matt Goodwin did. That would explain why Matt is persistently seething on Twitter and isn't receiving much backup from Reform HQ itself. Robert Jenrick, who defected from the Tories, is mistrusted by Reform members and seemingly reviled by Yusuf. And I think it's because Jenrick hasn't addressed the fact that he was the immigration minister who celebrated Afghans and Sudanese people being brought into Britain with their visas being fast-tracked on the scheme that he signed off on under Rishi Sunak. Wayne Broadhurst is dead because of the Afghans that Robert Jenrick praised the Boris government and the Sunak government for bringing into our country. And he hasn't said anything about it. And I understand there's the Official Secrets Act or whatever, but at the very least he could, I don't know, show up to a parliamentary debate and use parliamentary privilege to explain what happened during his years in the Home Office and try to acquit his conscience, if not expunge his record on the matter. But until he does so, and until he has a plausible excuse for why that happened on his watch, I think most people won't trust him. As well as, of course, saying the Bank of England's independence, which means unaccountability, and the Cameron Office for Budget Responsibility, which always gets its modelling wrong, and which, despite that fact, the Treasury and ministers have to take as sacrosanct, will remain in place. Which basically means the architecture of the state that has impoverished us will remain in place during his tenure as Chancellor. And why is he Chancellor in the first place, or Shadow Chancellor, or Treasury spokesman, or whatever, when he's a lawyer? And he's most effective when he's talking about matters of criminal justice. He seems to be played out of position, and it looks like naked careerism. And again, I've met Jenrick once or twice. I actually don't want to be rude to the guy, honestly. But these are questions that need to be resolved, and until they are, the Reform base won't trust him, and I think there's a significant portion of likely Reform voters, particularly former Labour voters, that will never trust him. So I don't know how viable his leadership bid would be. Anyway, Fraser writes, a contest would pose a directional dilemma. Does Reform continue to keep its recent theme of racial politics, saying that the white man is discriminated against and talking about banning the Muslim burqa and the Sikh kirpan? Or should it tilt to the centre to stand the better chance of governing? Fraser Nelson defines the sensible centre as saying the Boris wave was just an accident, saying that it's actually a benefit because we're the only country in Western Europe that's growing at 1% a year, purely because of immigration, saying that Britain is undergoing an integration miracle, and insisting upon that even when that article with that headline sparked the national conversation about the grooming gangs again in early 2025. Fraser Nelson defines the centre as mass migration continuing and diversity being our strength. He is an anachronistic radical whose politics do not belong here or in any time and place, who will cause an unrecoverable departure from all of the things that our ancestors intended for us, and who will destroy the family of families that comprises a nation, including our own. And so, if Fraser Nelson is saying, well, actually, lurching to the centre is the best way for Reform to govern, treat his advice as the poison that it is, and reject it. And the idea that Reform is engaging in racial politics, no, Henry Novak, who bled to death in police custody because the police's anti-racism training manuals taught them to treat him as the aggressor, because his killer accused him of racism, and that was enough to condemn him to death. That is the racial politics being imposed upon our country, our countrymen. We do not really think in racial terms in Britain, because we think quite individualistically, but we're being forced to because of the mass migration, the demographic change, the series of special protections afforded to minorities, and the DEI practiced even on the right in the Conservative Party, that Fraser Nelson didn't just celebrate, didn't just encourage, but was responsible for. Because remember, he ghost-wrote Kemi Badenoch's maiden speech in the Commons. So If this guy thinks that you're conducting evil far-right racial politics, you're doing something right, because the alternative is the hellscape we have lived under that has led to parties like Reform and Restore existing in the first place. But the man who will most likely have to answer that question is still Farage, Nelson writes. He spent a political lifetime policing the boundary between the respectable and the crazy right. He'd expel anyone on the Tommy Robinson side of the divide. Tommy Robinson is actually significantly to the left of some people in Reform. And he's significantly to the left of me. Like, he is still pro-legal migration from India. I am not and never will be. But the recent fight with Restore has ended up dragging him closer to the toxic territory, Nelson says. He always warned against mass deportation policies or the civilizational threat language of the hard right, but now he's losing the battle against the gravitational pull of the Elon Musk-era digital right. No, Fraser, reality has radicalized most people, I think including Farage, and he realizes that if you allow millions of people to stay in the country who've committed crimes, just the crime of breaking into the country in the first place, with the predatory intent to ogle and abuse British women and girls because smuggling gangs market our country like an open-air brothel that pays them to stay at the boarding house, if those people remain in our country, can break our laws without consequences, then we don't have a country anymore. So all of them need to go, and many more. Anyone who dares come into the country and be the recipient of taxpayer-funded accommodation or benefits. Sorry, I wouldn't dream of going to another country and imposing myself on its native taxpayers. Like, the sheer hubris and ingratitude for such a thing. They should go home too. And that is becoming a mainstream conversation. And that is just because it is a sensible measure. The disruption of which it will cause to these communities pales in comparison to the disruption caused to the native population who are losing possession of their country thanks to the policies you endorse, Fraser. And Fraser now says, tensions are now emerging at the top of Reform. Farage's aides have long talked about the path to 33% in the polls, which could mean a parliamentary majority, as a reason not to veer too far right. But Yusuf's approach, denouncing opponents as traitors, threatening to build deportation camps in part of the country that don't vote Reform, delights social media but unnerves wavering voters. Some see Yusuf as a loose cannon, toxifying and worse, loose-lipped. Farage's critics see him as a brilliant man with a blind spot when it comes to money. I think that's actually quite true. They wonder what he will do if forced to choose between politics or self-enrichment. His loyalties, they suspect, lie with Farage Inc., not Reform UK. And that's the perception that Farage has to change through his behaviour, not just clever messaging. So, Nelson says, licking his lips, it may be time to start thinking about Reform without Farage. He has always been underestimated and may yet talk his way through this, as he has talked his way through everything else. But the great escape artist now finds himself in a trap of his own making. Money he cannot explain, questions he cannot swat away, and a party that is no longer the one-man band it was. And that change in the party, that division among the ideas of its personnel, who all with leadership ambitions, once Farage has retired, or potentially is unceremoniously ousted, are laid bare in this Times piece, again, by Sebastian Payne, who was one of Michael Gove's advisors and just looks like one of his clones. He's a failed Tory candidate who is aging prematurely. He's gone like completely white with stress, or perhaps his own conscience bugging him. In here, he writes, there is a schism within the party about its direction. Some, notably its Home Affairs spokesman, Zia Yusuf, want to embrace the paranoid style as identified by the political scientist Richard Hofstadter when examining Barry Goldwater in the 1964 US presidential election, a conspiratorial worldview that finds enemies everywhere. In all fairness, it's a target-rich environment after 13 years of Tory betrayal. You can see this in Yusuf's attacks on the media, branding his rivals as traitors and his constant war with the amorphous establishment. It's not amorphous. It's actually got its avatar in you, the platonic form of the Tory boy, Sebastian. There is a reason some in Reform think Yusuf is a menace, as one senior councillor described him, and think his acolytes need to be contained, even banished from the party. So they're now seeing Zia Yusuf as the next figure to target for containment, because he is astute enough to realise that, and I think he's included in this, considering he called the police on Rupert Lowe, that banishing the right from Reform was a grave mistake, because it just created a parallel power base that has divided your potential supporters, who aren't just making their party affiliations known based on a character judgment of Reform and finding Farage wanting. It has divided your base because Rupert Lowe could have still been in Reform as its furthest right wing, retaining the faith of people who are principally concerned about immigration, demographic change, and accountability for the grooming gangs. He could be agitating within Reform for those policies and would have consolidated a significant chunk of votes in a broad tent that would mean reform is sitting at above 30% in the polls. And I think Yusuf recognises that, and even though to try and admit Rupert Lowe back into the party would be admitting wrongdoing that would basically see him lose his position, because, I mean, a false police allegation of that extent would open him up to lawsuits at the very least. Nevertheless, he is adopting the rhetoric and policies of the likes of Restore Britain to create a right flank of reform to try to regain those votes, with the additional argument that reform are the top of the polls, and so they're the most electorally viable vehicle if a general election is called between now and 2029. And what they're trying to do is banish Zia Yusuf, so reform just becomes another flavour of containment available to the voters. As Payne says here, another faction within reform argues for a less rebarative, more reasoned approach. See how they always attach sort of sensible, calm, adultish adjectives to their version of containment. So they're trying to say, if you want your country free of foreign criminals, benefits, scroungers, if you want to turn off the taps of mass migration that flooded your home and bail out some of the water, well, you're a far-right extremist. You just have to accept this inflow in a managed way that doesn't have to arouse the ire of rubes in Britain who are bitterly clinging to things like British identity and a love of peace and quiet. Payne outs these forces in reform as the former Conservatives who Yusuf openly loathes. They argue privately that the use of racial politics was necessary to see off Rupert Lowe's Restore, but the party ultimately needs to appeal to the centre to have any chance of winning. You'll find the ex-Tory MPs Robert Jenrick and Danny Kruger on this side of things, along with Reform's London mayoral candidate Layla Cunningham. She is the ultimate liability in reform. She will not win the London mayoralty. Voters in Bexley and Bromley cannot stand her, and she needs to be dropped. Especially because she's pulling this shit. Like, she went around in the aftermath of the local election saying, I was playing basketball with a bunch of urban youths, and they said, you're going to deport my mum, and the party needs to change its messaging about deportations. It needs to back off a bit, because otherwise we'll estrange minority voters that I'm trying to attract with my Indian jamboree that I'm leading around various neighbourhoods yelling, vote reform, namaste! I wish I was exaggerating. Reminder, also, Danny Kruger thinks that the entire country should be turned into Catherine Birbal Singh's Michaela School, and that Afghans can self-identify as English. So, for all his competence about rewiring the architecture of the state, he should be allowed nowhere near reform's messaging and demographic and immigration policies. If Zia Yusuf is a catacomb for the right in reform, and I have heard from people in reform that this is the case, then I can't believe I'm saying it, but he actually needs to be kept in place. Again, I've been very critical of Zia Yusuf. He does need to drop the Muslim LARP, because I don't wish to get personal, but it's pretty clear he's not actually a Muslim. It's just a plausible excuse that they used to try to deflect accusations of racism from the party by saying, here's this brown man who mouths the most right-wing things you've ever heard. Didn't work. They still call you a racist and an anti-Semite anyway, so you might as well drop the pretense. Nevertheless, I can't believe I'm saying it. Zia Yusuf is probably Reform's strongest soldier at this point. Farage is straddling both sides, Payne writes, sometimes coming across as more rational and traditional in his arguments, at other times he indulges in a paranoid style, as seen in his response to legitimate questions about the £5 million donation, but the uneasy internal truce is breaking down. Reform has done very well so far, thanks to a leader who outstrips the party's popularity, and who, despite its growth, has kept a lid on factionalism. Now both of those fundamentals are under threat, and they're under threat because of cuckoos in the nest. Someone was talking to The Observer, saying that they are quietly urging Farage to sack Zia Yusuf. Someone with looser lips and no loyalty ran to The Observer and said individuals within the party are understood to be making personal pleas to Farage to re-adopt his red lines on far-right extremism, that's code word for sensible policies on demographics and immigration, and are seeking to remove trigger-happy Zia Yusuf from his role. Quote, Zia's a big problem, said one person involved. Another source said there were some serious splits within the party that are going to break out at any point. Some in the party are concerned that Yusuf is part of a rightwards push, prompted by fears that Rupert Lowe's Restore party was outflanking them. True. During the by-election campaign, both parties seized on the murder of Henry Novak by 23-year-old Sikh man Vikram Digwa, and then the knife attack in Belfast by a Sudanese man when he attempted to behead a guy in the street. One senior party source said, we were definitely spooked by Restore, and I don't think that it was our finest hour. Nigel can carry on the Yusification of Reform, or he can rely on his instincts to keep Tommy Robinson well beyond where Reform stands, but he's got to make that decision. Reform shouldn't panic. There's lots of evidence we are still the main contender on the right, but the scale of tactical voting and persistence of it should be our focus, not Rupert. This person alleged to be making these leaks and the insistence on a centrist drift and the promotion of Tories at the expense of Yusuf is rumoured to be Tim Montgomery from people in the party. And it's conspicuous then that Tim said, I don't think the Tories hating on reform have any idea to the extent to which they are pushing people like me further and further away, because he was formerly the editor of Conservative Home, he founded Unheard, and then he publicly defected to Reform last year. And David Gauke, one of the former senior One Nation Tories who tried to sabotage Brexit, replied, I love how you are subtly having a go at Zia Yusuf UK, and Tim provided a winking emoji. Sorry, why is this allowed? Why is Tim allowed to be like a media representative for Reform if he's openly saying you need to oust your shadow Home Secretary, one of the party's senior-most spokesmen, and one of the most popular contenders for the leadership should Farage retire or be forced to step down? Why is Reform tolerating this? Who do they think they're winning over with this guy? And so it was very conspicuous that Zia Yusuf, when he was on Question Time, was being grilled by Kevin Hollinrake, because Hollinrake was saying, oh, you've got all these criticisms of the Tory party, but you've never been in government, you've never even run for a by-election. And Zia said, well, what makes you think I haven't put myself forward? You don't know that. And Kevin Hollinrake kept saying, well, hang on a minute. Are you saying that you've been put forward and you've been blocked? Do you have any evidence you've been put forward? So Zia seems to be suggesting, and the reason I'm not playing the clip is so that the BBC don't copyright strike me, thanks state broadcaster. The reason Zia seems to be saying this is to fire a flare, put a marker light on the contours of conflict within the party, suggesting that someone is trying to block him from standing. And with all the leaks to the press in the aftermath of the establishment's attempts to get rid of Nigel Farage, it seems there really is a concerted effort from both within and without Reform to either sabotage its chances or to morph it into the Tories 2.0, which it's already facing accusations of because it has many of Boris Johnson's personnel in senior positions. And one of the only people who hasn't got his hands bloodied by 14 years of Conservative failure, Zia Yusuf, is now being targeted by those same saboteurs. And to make it worse, there is the looming shadow of Boris Johnson leering over Nigel Farage's shoulder. Tim Shipman actually acknowledges, both in this article and in a podcast for The Spectator, that whomever coined the phrase Boris Wave, I believe it's coined by a defunct Twitter anon in a group chat, but then was popularised by Kunli Drupper and Max Tempers, two lads who just keep doing national services, well done gentlemen, have probably sunk Boris Johnson's career because his name is now synonymous with the millions of third world migrants that have come into our country, 6 million in 6 years, thanks to his changes to immigration policy. And of course, Priti Patel's tenure as Home Secretary, and his succession by his Chancellor, then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. But those close to him say he's beginning to feel the pull of the political game, according to Shipman. Multiple witnesses say he's driven by his hatred of Farage when the Conservatives opened their new headquarters at Castle Lane in Victoria, shortly after Andy Burnham beat Reform in the Makerfield by-election, which nobody heard about because nobody cares about the Tories. Johnson let rip in a speech. Is it not a wonderful, poetic and beautiful thing to see Reform now being devoured, hemorrhaging votes on the right to this party called Restore, which sounds like a sort of hair loss potion or something? Reform High Command is convinced that Johnson, along with Kemi Badenoch, is heading on Rupert Lowe, the leader of Restore, to kill Farage's momentum. Well, the boys in Restore certainly don't want anything to do with the Tories, but it is true, I think, that the Conservatives are gleeful that Reform created Restore and are now losing some of its supporters and high-profile canvassers to Restore by ousting Rupert Lowe and calling the police on him. So again, this was a self-inflicted wound that Reform themselves need to do some contrition to clear up. But it is conspicuous that, despite Kemi trying to fix the Conservative Party, apparently, Boris Johnson is still giving keynote speeches at Tory HQ. Clearly not changed that much. Friends of Johnson say he's privately made the case that Farage comes with a whiff of sulphur, a view he thinks has been justified by the response to questions about Christopher Harborne's donation. One close ally says Boris has made a lot of money and has a nice life, but he really hates Farage. He's in touch with Kemi, and I think you'll see him campaigning properly at the next election. He doesn't want Farage to be Prime Minister, because it would undo his legacy, of course. During the 2024 general election, a reluctant Johnson had to be coached to do one event for Rishi Sunak, whose resignation had triggered his downfall. He even complained to a friend in the car on the way, "Why should I help that? See you next Tuesday." Another long-standing friend says he does absolutely hate Nigel, and that has been exacerbated by Reform's personal attacks on him. His main attack line is they're just a bunch of Kremlin crawlies. Oh yeah, whinging about Russia when we're being demographically swamped by the people that you brought into the country will really be a convincing attack line, Boris. Keep making it. Let's see how it goes for you. But then there's Restore's reaction. And this may actually help reform in the long run, because, and I do not delight in reporting this to you, because again, some of my close friends are at the top of Restore, they seem to be undergoing a period of needless blunders by Rupert Lowe. He was on Patrick Bet-David's podcast recently, and he said, I'm not against a multicultural society so long as they integrate, which is an oxymoron, and also multiculturalism should never be spoken about favourably. It wasn't wanted, it won't work, it will never work. Stop talking about it and never embrace it. And also, he appeared on Brett Weinstein's podcast and denounced neo-Nazism and ethno-nationalism in the same breath, despite some of Restore's voters not thinking the term ethno-nationalism, as opposed to civic nationalism, which is, again, the proposition that Fraser Nelson holds, that anyone can become British, can self-identify as the heir to your civilization, just as someone might self-identify as a member of your family and write themselves into your will and take your house away from you. Ethno-nationalism is seen to be the opposite of that. I think it's a redundant and unhelpful term if you want to call yourself a nationalist, because you believe that nations, peoples, should possess their own nation-states and political systems that represent their interests, then that's totally fine. I think Ernest Gellner writes well on this. But ethno-nationalism is not the same as neo-Nazism. Neo-Nazism is like German racial socialism with a genocidal bent. If you think ethno-nationalism is the same as neo-Nazism, then how come Israel fits the definition of ethno-nationalism, but not Nazism? So, it's totally incoherent. And then, following this, after a series of attacks from the Daily Mail that put Rupert Lowe under pressure, Rupert Lowe decided to go to the Spectator Garden Party. Now, I just want to highlight some images from the Garden Party to show what cadre of creatures, villains, were at this party, and see if you can spot conspicuous absence. So we have Kemi Badenoch, we have Richard Tyson, Isabel Oakeshott, we have Freddie Gray, who censored my Spectator debate, chatting to Peter Hitchens, the guy who said we need to destroy the Tory party in the last moment, like Homer Simpson jumping in the air in the Quickie Mart, took the bullet for the Tories by saying you have to vote for Sunak. There is Matthias Dopfner, who's the new head of the Telegraph as part of the Axel Springer group, who said that as a goy, I am a Zionist, which is a weird thing to say. You'd just say Gentile, wouldn't you? Why are you using the derogatory term? And also said at ARC 2, Freddie Sayers, funnily enough, in an interview, that the Telegraph is going to become an activist outlet for, quote, the open society and a zero-tolerance policy against anti-Semitism. And then a couple of days later, they write a hit piece on me trying to get me deplatformed from buying me a coffee, destroying my livelihood by accusing me of being a far-right anti-Semite. How weird. You've got Lindsay Hoyle, you've got Nick Robinson, you've got Michael Gove, you've got Piers Morgan, you've got Morgan McSweeney there. These are the kinds of architects of our country's ruin that were invited. Conspicuously, oh, and look, Fraser Nelson, conspicuously, Nigel Farage didn't show up. Now, Tom Harwood said it's because he was told he didn't want to run into Rupert Lowe, but maybe Rupert said that. I've heard differently. Nevertheless, Rupert decided to go, and people were questioning whether or not Harwood was telling the truth, and not only was Rupert pictured posing for a photo with Harwood, which is strange because Harwood believes in mass migration, he believes that trans women are women, he's been on the wrong side of basically every issue. Also, there were people that overheard the conversation. And Harwood then, for some reason, not sticking to things being off the record, Harwood said, I chatted with Rupert Lowe last night at the Spectator Party. Interestingly, he said he detests ethno-nationalism and has to stamp on the young ethno-nationalists in the party. And then Harwood disclosed that Rupert was going on Joe Rogan's podcast, which has already been filmed and is awaiting release. And when people said, I think it was Scott Goetz, who writes for the Pimlico Journal, if any specific individuals were mentioned, Harwood said he implied he had a word with Charlie. So, if this is true, and I have reason to believe that it is, this is an act of disloyalty. Why are you talking to enemy journalists at an event designed to draw you into the noxious sphere of influence in Westminster, make you compromised by your personal relationships, the drinks events you'll be disinvited to, the opportunities to be interviewed on The Spectator or The Telegraph are unheard if you speak out against their comfy consensus, their ideology, basically the values of Michael Gove and Fraser Nelson. If you violate those taboos, which is the express purpose of Restore Britain, which is what Rupert Lowe said to Carl a few interviews ago when he said, I don't like going to these drinks parties, I don't like going to the Spectator Awards where they give out an award to Lucy Powell for denying the grooming gangs. When you go to these, you look like you're part of the establishment. And why would you then go to it and yuck it up with an enemy journalist, implying, even if by insinuation, that you're throwing your own guys under the bus? These are just a series of self-inflicted wounds that code as utterly disloyal to your base. And it shouldn't be done. You don't need to do this. And this has inhibited Restore's momentum through no fault, again, of Lewis, Charlie, and Harrison, who are all exceptionally talented, upstanding men, and who don't deserve this treatment, actually. And people are going to get very angry at me for saying this. And they're going to say, oh, this video is just purely pro-reform. And no, I'm trying to take a fair-minded assessment of the dynamics at play. And at the moment, Restore Britain has stalled its momentum, is alienating its own supporters, and is going to clown itself if it decides to participate in the witch hunt against Nigel Farage. Whether or not actual parliamentary procedures have been broken with those donations, a by-election in Clacton looks like an attempt to destroy his political career, and if Restore Britain participate in that, and run someone especially who has a vendetta against Farage, like, I don't know, the guy who Farage replaced in Clacton in Reform and didn't recompense his campaign costs for, or ex-UKIPper, Henry Bolton, who's just signed on as Restore's defence spokesperson. If they run someone like that, they're just going to look like the We Hate Farage party, and it's going to live up to all of the accusations that Reform-aligned media have already made of you, that you aren't a party of substance, you just want to destroy Reform. So, for some reason, there are people within Restore, and seemingly Rupert included, and again, I've spoken to Rupert, I've done interviews with Rupert, as you know, I think he's ultimately a good guy. For some reason, Restore are just insistent on stepping on every rake like their sideshow Bob. And one such rake, and again, I say this with nothing but respect, one such rake was Carl's video on online anonymous ethno-nationalists giving him grief in his mentions. And again, everyone knows I worked with Carl for years. He's a friend. I credit him and the Lowe Ceases in large part for my ability to meet my wife and have a family and have my career here. So all of this is said with the utmost respect and gratitude for Carl. I think this video struck the wrong tone, because the concerns about Rupert's rhetoric are valid, because these are, again, self-inflicted wounds. Nobody is forcing him to denounce his own base or talk to Tom Harwood and imply that he is telling off Charlie Downs in private. Nobody is forcing him to do this. I can only assume that he has succumbed to some social pressure after those Daily Mail headlines from either his, shooting buddies or someone in a members club or something going, oh, Rupert, you're not an evil Nazi, are you? Or some donor has withheld giving money to the party because they're worried about the impression it will give if the Daily Mail's calling you a racist. And so the I don't care attitude has gone out the window. And the entire point of Restore, the thing that allows people like Carl, who have been made figures of hate by the media, by Hope Not Hate, have had scarlet letters pressed on them for imprudent jokes made a few years ago. The entire thing that allows people like Carl or Charlie to be in the party is the I don't care attitude. It is to say that people like Emily Maitlis or Nick Robinson or Fraser Nelson or Tom Harwood have no moral legitimacy when they throw these smears and slurs at the party and its supporters. And if you start salami slicing off your supporters by dismissing them as a disposable vanguard, as Carl did, I think that's very unwise. Because the majority of people that self-identify as nationalists are not doing so ideologically. Carl is a very well-versed in philosophy, we've read many of the same texts, but lots of people haven't. They're instead just expressing their concerns, their horror at them and their children becoming hated minorities in their own country, and they want to see that stopped and reversed. And nationalism seems to be the best word to say, my loyalty is to my people, my children, and their future. It's just a tribal signifier and nothing more. And many people are anonymous because they will incur too many professional and personal costs from putting their face and name to very sensible opinions, such as, I don't want to become a hated minority in my own country, because Britain isn't a free country. And Carl and I have, at significant personal cost, we've lost personal relationships, we've been attacked by the media, I've had many hit pieces written about me. Hope Not Hate is basically an outfit for the state, and they have had a target on mine and Carl's head for many years. We have a significant personal cost to put our faces out there, but I don't recommend it. Like, some people need to do it, and maybe I just have a pathological lack of self-regard, or actually it's because I can't really perceive ahead of time the effect that what I'm going to say has, and I think this is just me being an autist. But I don't advise lots of people suddenly conscript themselves into yapping on the internet about the destruction of their country because, you know, you're basically unemployable. And you will lose friends and family members. And so I think because Cole has had that significant sacrifice, he's annoyed when some anonymous accounts don't take that into account and accuse him of being insufficiently staunch in his rhetoric, or they see what he thinks as prudent, incremental political activity as cucking or gatekeeping. I think he gets annoyed when he has people nipping at his heels. A minority, you know, a rambunctious, vocal, sometimes insulting minority, but it's not, nevertheless a minority of Anons, because we love our Anons, respect our Anons, some of my best friends, etc. He gets annoyed at that, and so has now turned on the Anons and told them, know your place. And that's never a message that's going to go over well. I think what Restore needs to do is cool off, get out of campaigning mode, ensure that it has the appropriate structure and mission statement that means it's a serious party, and that it isn't just a Nigel Farage revenge project, or at the very least doesn't come off like a Nigel Farage revenge project, because there are certainly people in Restore, like Charlie Harrison and Lewis, or Minihane, who are dedicated to fixing problems in the country, and that's their only driving factor. Otherwise, the net effect of Restore will be to temporarily drag reform right, and either collapse, or just prevent that rightward dragged reform from winning a governing majority. And of course, there are going to be plenty of people that say, well, I don't want reform to win a majority because I don't trust the person in reform. Fine, that's a character judgment that you're willing to make. But it will also make it significantly harder for the good people in Restore who are not motivated purely by sabotaging reform's chances to getting their agenda through, either in Restore or in reform via Restore. So all of these are things that we have to take into consideration. We shouldn't be infighting. We shouldn't be disparaging our Anons, no matter how rude they might be. It is incumbent on us, if we get annoyed by people in our Twitter mentions, to either mute them, or turn off your notifications, or just do what the Tyler the Creator tweet says that I can't repeat verbatim. Turn your phone off and go outside. It also should be in Reform's interest to bolster its credibility, to excise its traitors from its ranks, to ensure that Farage comes clean about the nature of the donations, and to lean into, not just credible policy, but authenticity again. People want to see barber jacket, dog walking, military historian Farage, or the sort of paternal care and stoicism that he showed during his Bush Tucker trials and I'm a Celebrity. People want to see substantive policy and unwavering conviction. Which is why, weirdly, despite including my mistrust of Zia Yusuf, his popularity has grown not just among the base, but I would say as a national political figure. None of what the parties are currently doing is helping the rescuing of our country from complete demographic, fiscal, and cultural demolition. And so everyone needs to get their act together. I'm not saying I've got all the answers, but I think hopefully I've provided some good advice. God knows if it gets listened to. And it's incumbent on us to be the kind of upstanding people that we would like to see in government, even if we don't plan on taking official positions ourselves, like I don't. Nevertheless, if you fail to prepare, you will prepare to fail, and Reform now has to prepare for being sabotaged by the establishment, because whether it's their war with Restore, or with all the other parties in the state combined, it's getting ugly and it's only going to get uglier.